Blue is my favorite color. Has been since I was a kid. And when I started my miniatures painting journey many years ago, I was made fun of for always making my armies blue. So you'd think I'd be really good at painting blue, right? Well, I might be if blue wasn't so dang hard to figure out. So that's what we're gonna do today. Figure out blue and paint a model in nothing but blue. See, the reason blue can be so awkward sometimes is because it comes in a gamut of shades. There's blue that's green shade and there's blue that are red shade. But while looking at the bottle, they just look like blue. By the time we get some white mixed in, they're actually worlds apart. So let's do a mixing grid for those variations of blue and see what I'm even talking about. So I have 4 different pure pigment blues here. Now the standard 2 we see most of the time in paint sets are Phthalo Blue, B15-3, and the pigment code's actually really important here, as this is a green shade blue, and Ultramarine Blue. The pigment code's not as important with this one, but the fact that it is red shade blue is. I also have a few other Phthalo Blues here, Pigment Blue 15-2 and Pigment Blue 15-4. Once again, a green shade, and the other a red shade. I'm going to swatch them onto my little mixing grid here. This one is the sci-fi version of the painting journal I'm working on. On their own, in their pure pigment form, they don't actually look all that different. Kinda just dark and bluey, right? Except for Ultramarine. It's a bit lighter in its pure form than the Phthalos. But when I mix in some white, that's when we can really start to tell the difference. And we can see the difference between a green shade and a red shade blue. The green shades have more of that classic sky blue look that we mostly associate with blue, pushing towards a teal, but not quite. While the red shades can look a little purple sometimes, especially if really heavily red shaded. And mixed together, you can get an assortment of neutral blues that are somewhere between those entirely. And this is why blue is such a problem. For one, in miniatures paint sets, it's really rare for them to tell you which shade of blue they're using. Techless blue sounds cool, but it gives us nothing when it comes to its mixing properties. Not only that, but most blues from miniature lines are also mixed with white already, which means that to darken them with black, you're actually getting a desaturated blue. And when grabbing a triad, you might end up going from green shade to red shade, which might look a little off. With this recent mini I painted, I started off with a green shade blue, but when I went to filter with an ink, the ink was more of a red shade. It turned out alright, but without the label saying anything, it can sometimes be hard to tell. And if which blue was used for a project was forgotten, good luck trying to match the right tone overall. So because blue has such a wide gamut of shades between green and purple, they can be really difficult to match. But I bet that means that I can paint a whole model with each of these blues and have them all look different. Of course, I'm going to need a miniature to paint. I'm going to pick something from this month's one-page rules Grimdark release, Dwarf Guilds. I'm going to go with one of these power suits, because with the helmet on, I don't think I'd need that many colors, so I can get away with a limited palette. But also this month are the bikers with their champion, and if that's not enough firepower for you, the trikes, which add a sidecar and gun. Lastly, the massive combat excavator, for when you need to dig through the ditches and burn all the witches. Get all this and more on this month's one-page rules Patreon. I'm starting on a dark gray primer layer because, well, none of these blues are best for covering, so black is just too dark to start with if I want any vibrancy. So not only can I vary the hue of the blue with the different types, but I can also vary the shade with white and black, as long as it stays blue. So I'm going to start with the Phthalo Blue green shade from Chimera, and some black, and use a tiny bit of white ink in there just to give it some opacity. I'll be spraying this all over the model to give me a foundation to paint from. but also because I want to keep most of the inner layers, like the pants and stuff, darker. I'll use the shade to differentiate my blues as well as the hue. I went with a green shade because shadows would be cooler and green shade blues are cool blues. I do a little bit of highlight layering with a brush by just adding a little more white into that mix with the black and blue, so that it stays more desaturated as well as dark. Phthalo blue is a strong pigment, and so it'll stay pretty vibrant even with a lot of black and white in it. But by desaturating it that little bit, it'll keep these shadows low-key on the overall model. I'll do one more layer with a bit more white into the last mix. Like I said before, I don't actually want this to get too bright compared to the rest of it. So this is as light as I'm going to go, and only on the most exposed area, basically just the folds and upper elbow. It should give the feeling of light without getting too bright. For the next two stages, I want to use the two main blues you find in most paint sets, Phthalo Blue 15-3 and Ultramarine Blue, because I want to showcase those colors the most with this experiment because I think they have the most difference between them. So I'm adding nothing but white to those pure pigments, starting with the phthalo. And I'm not going to do a normal mix and layer either. I want these plates to have a nice gradient to them, so I'm going to do loaded brush blending using my angled brush to create a gradient from light to dark. Phthalo blue is the dominant color in any mix, so while the white might start brightly, it'll quickly be overcome by the blue to get a light blue with no hint of the white left over. Now of course the first layer of anything isn't ever the best, so I'm going to do a second pass when everything's fully dry with the same technique, just to fill in all those brush lines. It does appear a little messy in the end still, so now comes the cleanup. I'm going to actually make a mix of the pigment blue 15-3 and white, aiming for something that's about as light as my lightest point in the wet blends. With this, I'm going to outline all the edges. This will give shape to all the different gradients that I created in the last step and make sure that the actual plates can be picked out by the eye. Unfortunately, it does mean a lot of work since edge lining is not that easy, but it will be the best way to clean those edges and separate out different plate facings. For my next blue, not only am I going to change hue by using ultramarine for the red shade, but also I'm going to lighten it up significantly and start from a much brighter base. The only things I'm going to pick out are some of the top layers with this, so the accents and icons mostly. Since it should look pretty different, it'll be good for just adding that variety to the plates and make some of the symbols more visible among the overall blue. And of course, even with the white, it's not going to cover perfectly the first time, so I make sure to do an extra coat to make sure it's an opaque layer. For the intermediate layer, I'm just going to add a bit more white in and start to pick out the highlight zones, trying to follow where they are with the previous blue. I don't even care if the edges are rough though, because I'll thin out the mix with some more medium, and just do a quick glaze, pulling that diluted mix into the center to glaze out those highlights. But also take the time to catch the edges around them with some as well, so that the highlight follows along the light edges. And for the last layer, I'll just mix in even more white, but not a pure white because I still want that tone of blue. Otherwise, I'd consider it white, not blue, and the point is to make the model blue. And with this, I'll just ping some of the edges, adding the lighter paint to the lit edges, but also extending out some of the corners onto the flat panels just to have that light bursting from that corner. I've got one blue left, the Chimera red shade, but unfortunately it's not going to get the showcase it deserves as I'm going to be mixing it with black and just a touch of white for something that was even darker than my base layer. Because the idea for this one is to do some non-metal metal, which ultimately will be more of a contrast between black and white, but it isn't without precedent. Almost all of my steel non-metal metals have some blue in them. Adding that tint of blue can help it look like a cold steel. So it'll be interesting to see how using this warm blue does in that regard. The next layer is just a bit more white for a dark blue gray, which will be a significant increment to the dark base I just put down. Like the mid layer on the light ultramarine, I want to do the same thing again. Find out where those light sweeps are supposed to go on the plates and blades of the weapons, trying to keep it in line with some of the light reflections in the blue. Non-metal metal is all about contrast, so in that spirit, I'm jumping up a huge shade and adding a bunch of white. I'll be adding this to the edges mostly, but adding some reflections down into the darker highlights still too. The good news is that this really won't dry as bright as it goes on, so while it does look like a massive step up, it's not actually that much of a difference once it dries. Which means I can do one more highlight with a much brighter white. Of course, making sure some of that blue is still in there though. And I'm just going to poke this at the sharp edges and give them a ping of light off the corners. I will extend some of them, but mostly only where it's really light in the surrounding area. Anywhere else it's kind of dark, it's just the corner that gets that ping. So have I conquered blue? Not by a long shot, I'd say, but I hope what I have done is showcase the difference between green and red shade blues and maybe shared a few ideas about how and where to use them. Will I stop painting my armies blue? Not bloody likely, it's still my favorite color after all. And with this model, I've only just gone and figured out how I can add even more blue. If you liked this video, give it a like and check out another video from my channel. Also find a link to my Patreon in the description. It's free to join, and my store has both videos and STLs to further explore your painting journey.